In the last section, we learned that we were going to run into some big issues when using a functional component with this geolocation API. The whole big problem with this is that it takes some amount of time for the geolocation service to return our position. By the time it finally returns our position, we have already rendered our app component onto the screen. And with a functional component, we don't have any good way of re-rendering it automatically or somehow telling the app component to pause its rendering process. So in this section, we're going to start to take a look at how we're going to solve this. So ideally, we're still going to use the geolocation service. We're still going to have some app component, be it a functional component or a class-based one. But then after we finally get that result, we want to somehow tell our component to re-render itself, or essentially update the content on the screen with this new information. So step one in this entire process is to create a class-based component instead of the functional one that we are currently using. Once we move over to a class-based component, we'll then be able to use React's state system. So essentially, we're going to learn these two different things at the same time. We're going to learn about JavaScript React classes, class-based components, and state in React at the same time. But don't worry, it won't be that bad. Okay, so here's our rules of creating a class-based component. First off, we must create a JavaScript class. JavaScript classes were introduced with ES 2015. If you're coming from the language of Ruby or Java, these are not technically classes when we're working with JavaScript. JavaScript inheritance works on prototypal inheritance, which works a little bit differently than classic inheritance featured in Java or Ruby or similar object-oriented programming languages. But from our perspective, it's basically going to be working like a class. The second requirement is that the class we create must extend, or again, if you're coming from the world of Ruby or Java, subclass would be the term that we use, React.component. We'll talk more about exactly what this means in just a moment when we refactor the app. And then finally, the only big requirement of our class-based components is that they must define a render method that is going to return some JSX. All right, so with these rules in mind, let's flip back over to our editor and we're going to start to refactor this app component. Now to get started, I'm going to leave this functional component right here for right now so that we can easily refer back to it in just a moment and make some comparisons between the functional and class-based implementation of our app. Okay, so I'm going to give myself a couple lines down here, and then I'll say class app extends. Notice how there's an S on here, it's not just extend, react.component. I'll then open up the class body with the curly braces, and then I'm going to define a render method like so. Then inside the render method, I'm going to return a div with the text latitude, just like we had before. And that's it. That's all we really had to do. That's pretty much it. Now, obviously, we're not calling the geolocation API, but this right here is a valid class-based component that we just put together. Now, I am going to pull over the geolocation API stuff right here. So I'm going to cut all that stuff and put it down into the render method like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete the original functional component. And so now we're left with just the class-based one. All right. So now I want to tell you a little bit more about this extending React.component thing right here. When we make a class, we are creating a new class inside of JavaScript that has just one method assigned to it, and that is the render method. In order to use a class-based component with React, however, React expects that our class-based component has many other methods attached to it. Now, normally we do not implement these methods by ourselves. Instead, we borrow all these other methods from this other class called React.component. So essentially, the reason that we are extending React.component right here is that it allows us to pull a ton of built-in functionality from this other class called React.component into our class. That's just a fancy way of saying that we are subclassing React.component. We're just borrowing functionality into our app class. All right, so let's now save this. I'll then flip back over to my browser. And at this point, I'm just going to expect to still see latitude to appear on the screen. And it definitely does. And I can refresh the page, and yep, I still get it like so. Now, just turning that functional component into a class-based one is not going to inherently solve any of the problems that we have around fetching or taking too long to determine our physical location. Just using the class-based component alone doesn't solve anything. But it's step one towards getting towards a solution. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we'll talk about step 2 of our solution, which is to use React's state system. And this is where things are going to get really interesting. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.